In this video, we're going to talk about the law of the sea and its impact on human safety in the Arctic. The Arctic is different from Antarctica insofar as at the core, at the heart of the Arctic, there's an ocean. Even though climate change dramatically changes the Arctic Ocean and has a huge impact on the way we perceive the Arctic Ocean, it's not yet a new Mediterranean. But if you look at a map of the Arctic centered on the North Pole, you will see that the Arctic surrounds an ocean which is becoming more and more accessible, with an ocean about which we don't know very much yet. We're still learning a lot about the marine biology, for example, in the Arctic, about the natural resources in the region. But already today it's clear that we will see less and less sea ice in the Arctic. The Arctic Ocean becomes more and more accessible for shipping. We see this not only with regard to the extraction of natural resources, for example in the Norwegian, American or Russian Arctic, but also in the form of tourism. Before the pandemic, cruise tourism in the Arctic experienced a super boom, meaning that there was an enormous interest in visiting the region. The Arctic Ocean provides a shortcut, for example, between East Asia and Europe for the transport of goods. A shorter sea route means not only faster transport, but also savings, which in turn is good for the economy overall, both sides of the sea routes. In particular in the northern sea route going along the northern coast of Russia. The Arctic Ocean is also important for food security. If you look at the situation, not only in places like northern Norway or northern Russia, but especially in Greenland, in Canada, northern Alaska, the ocean is a source of nutrition, of a lot of the food needed by the people who live in the Arctic. From a governance perspective, the Arctic Ocean is important because this is where global and regional interests meet. The international law of the sea governs the Arctic Ocean, but at the same time have a lot of the cooperative efforts in the Arctic centered on the sea. For example, international treaties which have been concluded under the auspices of the Arctic Council. The international law of the sea is increasingly relevant for the Central Arctic, for fishing, for shipping, for natural resources, but also for the protection of the marine environment. When we talk about the law of the sea here, we talk about public law. I mean, public international law, the rules for ships, for the different uses of the sea, maritime zones, delimitation, and so on. We're not talking about what I would rather call maritime law, international transport law, sales law, insurance law, and so on. So in this video, we're going to focus on a public law aspect of the international law of the sea and how it can play a role in safeguarding human safety in the Arctic. Therefore, to this end, we're going to take a step back and I want to give you a quick introduction to the international law of the sea. On key concepts like sovereignty, sovereign rights, marine spaces, and so on. This is important in order to understand why international law is so important in regulating the issues in the Arctic Ocean, which are relevant for local communities, like the conservation of marine living resources, like protection against oil spills from increased shipping activities, for example, or the protection of biodiversity. The international law of the sea is one of the oldest classical branches of international law. It has to be seen in the context of public international law in general. It can be traced back hundreds, in fact thousands of years. Now, the international law of the sea is always dominated by the attempt to balance competing interests. The interests of the people living along the coast and those who want to use the sea for navigation, fishing, and so on. In the following, we will refer to those entities as the coastal states and the flag states. Of course, often states have both functions, but they're functionally different. A flag state is a state of which the flag of which is flown by a ship, meaning where a ship is registered, while the coastal state, as the name implies, is the state coast of which is affected by any activities. And coast here means not just the coast, but the waters immediately adjacent to the coast. For the longest time, the international law of the sea has been customary international law, but in the 20th century, we've seen a strong push towards codification, especially since the 1950s. In 1982, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was adopted. And to this day, that's still the key set of norms. It's sometimes been referred to as a constitution for the oceans. It's basically a framework. It doesn't regulate every little detail, but it's a framework for the governance of the oceans. It's a global instrument. It's not an instrument made in the Arctic specifically for the Arctic, but it's meant to apply globally. Arctic states, of course, played a role in shaping these norms, but there were only a few among almost 200 states which are coming together in this context. The rules contained in the Law of the Sea Convention have been made more precise. There are additional, more technical rules created under the auspices of the International Maritime Organization, for example, with regard to ship operations. These rules regulate specific activities. In the context of ship operations, we have a number of specialized treaties. For example, MARPOL regarding marine pollution, or SOLAS, the Convention on Safety of Lives at Sea. In the next step, we have even more specialized norms like the Polar Code. The Polar Code is a legally binding instrument which entered into force on January the 1st, 2017, and which has been created within the legal framework provided by SOLAS and MARPOL, the two aforementioned treaties on human safety at sea and marine pollution. And they are built on top of the quasi-constitutional framework provided by the Law of the Sea Convention. The Polar Code contains norms which aim at making ship operations in the Arctic and in the Southern Ocean safer, thereby contribute to enhancing human safety at sea and reducing the risk of marine pollution. And that's important because the oceans do matter for the local communities. They matter not just for fishing or transport, but also for natural resources. The Arctic Ocean is an important source of livelihoods and also of safety. Of course, it's also an inherently dangerous place. If you look at statistics of fishing areas, fishing in the Arctic is incredibly dangerous. Climate change dramatically changes the Arctic Ocean, but it does not turn it into a relatively safe sea, let's say like the Baltic Sea, which can be tricky in its own right, or it doesn't change it overnight. It's still a relatively dangerous place to operate in. By its very nature, the international law of the sea has to be global. Oceans connect the whole world, and the international law of the sea applies to the oceans and the seas as such. Seas, within legal meaning, basically refers to everything that's connected to each other. So the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, there are seas which are covered by the international law of the sea. While the Caspian Sea, even though it's large, it's technically not covered by the Law of the Sea Convention, as it's not connected to the rest of the world's oceans. For the purposes of our course, we are just looking at the Law of the Sea Convention. We won't go into too much detail with regard to other norms. The idea of this part of the course is that you get a basic understanding of how the Law of the Sea Convention works, which topics it covers, and why it is relevant for the people who live in the Arctic. And also to a certain degree, why this can be a point of contention between Arctic and non-Arctic states. After all, the non-Arctic states are by far in the majority when it comes to developing the international law of the sea further. The law of the sea is based on the idea of spaces. The entire convention, when you look at its structure, is based on the notion of different maritime zones, and they always begin at the coastline, or rather even within the nation state. You have internal waters, for example, within a port. They're under the full sovereignty of the nation state. A bit further out, there's the territorial sea, up to 12 nautical miles. Nautical mile is a bit more than 1.8 kilometers. Up to 12 nautical miles, you have the territorial sea. Some states claim a contiguous zone in which they can enforce a number of norms, for example, regarding public health, immigration, against drug smuggling, stuff like that. And more importantly, up to 200 nautical miles from the coast, states can claim an exclusive economic zone. This used to be called an exclusive fisheries zone. Now it also covers other economic uses. And within these areas, the coastal state has the sole right to exploit natural resources, but also duty to manage the area and to protect it, for example, against pollution. Other states have specific rights in these areas. For example, in the territorial sea, a foreign ship has the right to innocent passage. Beyond the exclusive economic zone, there's the high seas. Overlapping potentially with both is the continental shelf, which is very interesting from an economic perspective because this is where a lot of the oil and gas is. The high seas then are beyond the jurisdiction of all nation states. This is where only the jurisdiction of the coastal state the flag state applies, where the coastal state does not have jurisdiction anymore. Finally, we have the deep seabed, where we now have a specific international legal regime aimed at exploring and exploiting in a fair and hopefully sustainable manner the resources which can be found there. The law of the sea regulates the rights and obligations of different actors in these different zones. As a rule of thumb, the closer you are to the coast, the stronger the rights of the coastal state are. In the territorial sea, the coastal state has full sovereignty, though it has to allow a number of activities by others, while further out in the exclusive economic zone, there are only specific sovereign rights enjoyed by the coastal state, but they are exclusive and only for the coastal state. But the law of the sea also serves the purpose of ocean management. Proper ocean management requires international coordination, and that's something that we see quite a lot in the Arctic. We need cooperation in order to ensure that the Arctic Ocean can be protected. There's still very much we don't know about the biosphere in the Arctic Ocean, and we're still learning. The spatial scope, however, of the Law of the Sea Convention is often not really appropriate to deal with the reality at sea. The marine life, the biosphere, does not care about lines on maps if they are 12 or 200 nautical miles away from the land. A lot of fish species are highly migratory. The same for marine mammals. Law and nature often diverge when it comes to the sea. That's why in recent years the trend has been towards a more holistic approach in ocean management, in that we look now at biological systems and no longer just at artificial lines on maps, but rather at the reality at sea. Pollution also does not stop at borders. The Law of the Sea Convention now provides a legal framework which allows states not only to balance their rights and interests against each other, but also to cooperate with each other, especially for the purpose of protecting the marine environment. In the maritime sector, in the marine sector, international cooperation is essential. These two basic approaches, the zonal approach on one hand, the classical approach, and this more holistic approach when it comes to protecting the marine environment. They're not exclusive, they're not standing next to each other, but they both apply at the same time. They coexist. And it's essential for the law of the sea that we try to reconcile these two different approaches. The Law of the Sea Convention only provides a framework. The actual protection has to be undertaken by state actors. The ocean as a whole is the object of regulation here. Every marine space is connected to the rest of the world ocean. As I mentioned, lakes like the Caspian Sea, but also rivers, for example, they fall within distinct legal regimes. We have two types of maritime zones described in the Law of the Sea Convention. Those which are under the national jurisdiction of the coastal state and those which are not. Those which are not are the high seas and the deep seabed area. Those which are under the jurisdiction in some form or other of the coastal state are the internal waters and the territorial sea with full sovereignty, but also international straits, archipelagic waters, the contiguous zone, the exclusive economic zone, and the continental shelf. How far the jurisdiction of the coastal state goes, that differs quite a lot between these different zones. And these differences are important because that's how the international community expresses the balance between the rights and interests of coastal states on one hand and flag states on the other hand. Territorial sovereignty is characterized by exclusiveness. If you have complete jurisdiction, for example, in your territorial sea, you have comprehensive jurisdiction over these waters like you have over land territory. There are no limits with regard to the subject matter or the persons. No other state can exercise jurisdiction there. That applies to the territorial sea as well as to the internal waters, but also to international straits and archipelagic waters. The fact that the coastal state has to allow certain activities there, like innocent passage of foreign ships, does not mean that it has less jurisdiction. It still has full jurisdiction over these waters. Beyond the territorial sovereignty, we have marine spaces with sovereign rights, but less than full sovereignty. The contiguous zone, for example, the exclusive economic zone, and the continental shelf. Here, in such areas, the jurisdiction of the coastal state is limited to matters which are defined by international law. And that's a key difference made in the Law of the Sea Convention, key distinction. That you have areas with full sovereignty, and the sovereignty exists not because of the Law of the Sea Convention, but because it's an effect, so to say, of the sovereignty the state has over the land territory. The territorial sea, as the name already implies, is basically just a continuation of the land territory. In the contiguous zone, the exclusive economic zone, and on the continental shelf, on the other hand, the coastal state has sovereign rights, but not full sovereignty. And these rights only exist because international law is giving them to the states, to the coastal states. Hence, the jurisdiction is also limited to those issues covered by the Law of the Sea Convention in this regard. Sovereign rights, in a sense, are limited in terms of form of limited spatial jurisdiction, while the full sovereignty includes complete spatial jurisdiction on all issues. The use of the marine environment for navigation, communication, and so on, makes it necessary to have access to different parts of the seas. And that is an issue that's also relevant for the Arctic, especially when we look at places like the Northern Sea Route along the coast of Russia, which is being used also by non-local actors for the transport of goods. The Law of the Sea Convention tries to reconcile these different interests and rights. Shipping through the Arctic provides savings, financial savings, time-wise as well, when compared to the traditional shipping routes. If you look at a map of the world and you look at how much shorter the route, or if you look at a globe, you'll see how much shorter the route along the Northern Sea Route is compared to, say, going from China through the Strait of Malacca and through the Suez Canal to Western Europe. In the future, we might even see a trans-Arctic shipping route, today basically restricted to the Northwest Passage, through Canada and along the Russian coast. Right now, the lack of a trans-Arctic passage means that a lot of the Arctic shipping traffic happens near coasts. And that leads to potential legal conflicts between flag states and coastal states. That brings us to the question, how far does the freedom of navigation go? The freedom of navigation and freedom of shipping, which is now contained in the Law of the Sea Convention as the freedom of the high seas, that's a concept that's over 400 years old, dating back to Hugo Grotius and his book, The Mare Liberum of 1608. There's this idea that the ocean should be free for commerce, free for navigation. In the 20th century, the rights of coastal states have been expanded continuously, which now leads to a higher potential for conflicts. At the same time, though, the international legal system has reacted and has created a framework in the Law of the Sea Convention for these different legal maritime zones, and we have now different legal solutions to balance these competing interests. Shipping can now mean a lot of different things in the Arctic. There can be fishing, hunting, including by indigenous communities, transport of persons, offshore work for oil drills, for example, cargo transport, transport of passengers, cruise ships, and so on. In particular, the transport of raw materials from the Arctic is an issue that's of growing importance. For example, along Russia's Northern Sea Route, with the new port in Sabetta and the extraction of natural resources, especially in northern Russia, and the transport to China, for example. Arctic shipping increases and becomes more and more relevant because it's becoming somewhat easier. Less ice still doesn't mean no ice, there's still a risk here. And the Polar Code, which I mentioned earlier, still mentions risks associated with ship operations in polar waters. Bergy waters, for example, meaning water where there's quite a lot of ice still present. Long hours of darkness, long hours of daylight, things like this. The weather is still much less predictable than elsewhere. And of course, there's a much more limited search and rescue infrastructure. And that's something that has been recognized, for example, by the Arctic Council. And now we have this international agreement on search and rescue operations in the Arctic. But also things that are taken for granted elsewhere don't work as well in the Arctic. For example, you might often have problems with communication satellites, which might not cover polar regions. And of course, there are relatively simple problems like topside icing on ships. When it's cold, water freezes, and you might have a lot of icy surfaces on ships, including ladders, stairs, and so on. If you work on a ship, your work environment, which might have been perfectly safe, let's say the Atlantic relatively speaking, safe, in the Atlantic or the Mediterranean becomes much more dangerous in same setting in the Arctic. These are challenges which are addressed in the Polar Code. And it's important that we have this document which brings together a number of approaches. It's not just technical in nature, even though it contains a lot of technical norms, but it also is about the behavior of people on ships. The Polar Code, for example, affects the training of seafarers. There's an international treaty on including standards for training, certification, and watchkeeping, the STCW Convention, which this treaty makes sure that the training received by seafarers is comparable worldwide. So if you become a seafarer, let's say in India or Nigeria or in Norway, you basically have the same kind of training so that your qualifications can be compared. This is an inherently international business, and most crews are very international. The increased ship operations in the Arctic and the Southern Ocean made it necessary to also improve training in this regard. So here, human factors and technical factors come together. Coastal states, of course, have an interest of safeguarding the natural environment close to their coast. They don't want the risk of ship accidents, for example, because it could lead to pollution and to negative impacts on their natural environment. Yet, the Law of the Sea Convention is still relatively silent on the Arctic. The notable exception is Article 234, the Law of the Sea Convention, which allows coastal states which have in their exclusive economic zones areas which experience a lot of sea ice or which are covered by sea ice for most of the year. Those states, they are allowed to enact specific norms which aim at protecting the natural environment there better. This, in practice, now applies to Canada and Russia, because the United States is not a party to the Law of the Sea Convention. But one of the questions that the legal community will have to answer in the coming years is whether this norm, Article 234 of the Law of the Sea Convention, still remains relevant now that the sea ice is disappearing. The text of the norm seems to imply that this might not be the case because it requires that sea ice is present for most of the year. Yet this is a debate that has already been going on for some time, and we'll see if these special norms which apply to the Arctic, if they're still relevant in the future. Climate change fundamentally changes the Arctic Ocean, and it might become a bit more of a normal ocean, changing from white to blue, in a sense. As this happens, shipping is likely to increase in the Arctic, and with it, the risk of oil spills, for example, of accidents. And that will bring conflicts, legal issues, which we see elsewhere, also to the Arctic. We have very few legal controversies in the Arctic. One of them concerns the legal status of the Northwest Passage, for example, which Canada claims are so-called internal waters, and for which a transit permit is required. This has been contested by a couple of states, but for example, now in the COVID-19 pandemic, Canada quickly outlawed cruise tourism to remote Arctic locations, which was a good decision from the perspective of public health, because cruise ships are a severe risk for infectious diseases like COVID-19, and the small locations in the Arctic would have been extremely ill-prepared to deal with a major outbreak. This measure would not have been possible as easily had it not been for the approach by past Canadian governments to treat the Northwest Passage as internal waters, even though it's controversial from an international legal perspective. Currently, with regard to both the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage, nobody really has an interest in fighting over these legal questions. What is important is that measures are being taken to protect the natural environment and the people who live in the Arctic. Because ship operations can have numerous negative effects. If you think, for example, of a ship in a small port, a cruise ship, visiting a small place somewhere in the Arctic, what is happening is that the ship's engines, for example, they have to run all the time in order to generate electricity for all the things needed on board, everything that somehow requires electricity. And the fuel burned by ships is still relatively dirty ship diesel. The shipping industry is not part of the Paris Climate Agreement. And right now there's a strong push towards cleaner shipping, cleaner fuels in shipping. And hopefully we will get there in the not too far future. But this remains a major challenge. There is a bit of industry self-regulation, which is already making a big step forward. Norway is taking some positive steps in this regard, but these are really just small steps towards some improvement. Having a ship's engine run in port all the time means much more air pollution. It means much higher risk of lung diseases and so on, other diseases, cancers, potentially, for the people who live there. Of course, an oil spill in the Arctic is, from the perspective of local communities, coastal communities, it's an absolute nightmare. You may have heard of the Exxon Valdez spill in the 80s. 25 years later, oil from that oil spill in southern Alaska was still found in some tidal pools. It takes much longer for oil to dissolve in the Arctic climate. The negative impact on the natural environment would be severe. And of course, it would be, as the Exxon Valdez case shows, also severe in terms of food security and the local economy. Oil pollution is a major risk for the Arctic. And that's something that has to be taken into account with a lot of different activities in the Arctic, be it ship operations or oil drilling. Also, we have a limited infrastructure when it comes to search and rescue operations in the Arctic. Some time ago, there was the Crystal Serenity incident involving 1,700 people on board. Fortunately, we have not had a major disaster with huge loss of life in the Arctic when it comes to cruise shipping, but experiences like the loss of the Selindang Ayu with several crew members died, even a US Coast Guard helicopter crashed due to bad weather. These are examples which show that the Arctic Ocean remains a dangerous place. There's still an inherent risk in operations in the Arctic Ocean, both for people on board and for the people who live in the region. Be it directly when it comes to safety through the operations of vessels, or indirectly through pollution, be it air pollution or marine pollution. The Polar Code, which entered into force in 2017, is an important step in the right direction. That's only one step. As climate change is making the Arctic more and more accessible, we will see more of these challenges, more problems, and steps which are being taken today, like the idea of the heavy fuel oil ban, the Arctic, for example. They are important because Arctic shipping is likely to become more and more relevant in the future. The Arctic Ocean is melting. The sea ice is disappearing. The map you might have in your mind of the Arctic Ocean, the white ice cap on top of the world, that's not correct anymore. The sea ice is disappearing, and it's disappearing rapidly. Within a few decades, probably before the middle of the century, we will have almost completely ice-free summers in the Arctic. The Arctic Ocean is becoming more and more an ocean like all the others. And as an ocean like all the others, it will also see similar challenges. The law of the sea is an important tool for the governance of the Arctic Ocean, but it's also a tool which is influenced heavily by non-Arctic actors. And so far, also for the communities around the Arctic Ocean, it will be important to recognize that a lot of the norms which affect them will not be made in the Arctic, but they will be global in nature. We have important steps which have already been taken to improve the protection of the marine environment in the Arctic, but we still don't have a regional seas program, for example. There's still a lot to be done to protect the unique and very vulnerable marine environment in the Arctic, not just as the environment, but also for the protection of human safety in the Arctic, both for the people who live in the Arctic and those who visit and work there.